Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shayan Sharif, and I'll be moderating the session today. First of all, I just wanted to say my thanks to all of you, especially to our panelists who accepted the invitation to attend today's and participate actively in today's conversation. And I would also like to express my gratitude to all of you who've attended here. I know that in the past we would have done this in a face-to-face manner, and I hope that before too long we can do that and go back to those good old days of having lunches and dinners and having a good glass of wine or a good glass of beer in a sunny afternoon like today. I'm actually just feeling as if, you know, I really want to go back to my normal life, but here we go. This is during pandemic, and the main focus of today is really to talk about the pandemic and how it has impacted our industry and what have we learned and what we would actually like to do in the future to mitigate, you know, some of the risks associated with not only this pandemic, but also future pandemics that will come our way, hopefully not anytime soon, but I think we've been all talking about a potential pandemic for a very long time, and it is here. It's believe me or not, as a person who's been working with pandemics and pandemic viruses, this is nothing compared to what could have actually happened if this were to be an avian influenza virus that would have jumped from avian species to human species and could have actually gone from humans to humans. That would have really wreaked havoc in the world, much more than this virus. So I think, you know, we need to think about that. And also at the same time, we need to think about, you know, what we are going to do in the future to gain a competitive advantage compared to others, because this is going to end hopefully at some point in the future. And I hope that we are going to come out of it much stronger than we went into it. So the main purpose for today is really to talk about that. And I don't really think that I need to emphasize the fact that this was actually a major wake-up call for many of us in the industry, in the government, and also in academia. We really understood now how our food systems are so interconnected, intricate, and how fragile our food systems are. One thing happens, you know, in a state down in southern part of the US, and all of a sudden we see major ripple effects in Ontario and across Canada and perhaps globally. And that actually showed us how our food systems are interconnected and and how fragile they are. Maybe, you know, this was known, it was a known fact to some of us, but it has become a known fact to our consumers that this is a food system that we have to protect and we have to secure it as much as we could. As I said before, I work with viruses, and when I reflect on some of the predictions that I had made in my grant applications, in my seminars and so forth, I would have usually said an avian influenza pandemic would cause approximately a $3 trillion economic loss to the world. Now I'm looking at this virus, which is probably by a few orders of magnitude less malignant than an avian influenza virus, and it's already caused a few $1 trillion economic losses to the world. I'm really thinking that, you know, I was grossly underestimating any future pandemics caused by viruses that could actually originate in avian species. So I think, you know, this is definitely the right sector to talk about pandemics and what pandemics could do in the future and what we've learned from this pandemic so that we can implement better strategies for the future. And, you know, I know that we are still not completely out of the woods yet. This pandemic is still ongoing. It could actually come back again in the fall, could come back next year. We don't actually know. As many of us had said before, viruses have no respect for national or international borders. They have no respect for policies and for politics. And as a result of that, there is a very good chance that this virus is going to come back. But we felt that this would be a good time to start a conversation. I know that there are a lot of other conversations going on at a variety of different levels, including my colleague Evan Fraser, who's actually joined us just a few minutes ago. I know that as the director of the Aerial Food Institute, he's also going to be initiating conversations at a much higher levels. And I hope that this would actually be a stepping stone and as a complementary part of the discussions and conversations that Aerial is going to be having in the future in regard to food policy and how to secure our food systems and food supplies. This was actually a brainchild of three of us, Mike McMorris, Ashley Hansberger and myself, we basically thought that, it would be really cool to talk about what this pandemic is telling us, what we can learn, and how to implement things for the future. So as you're going to see, most of the discussions that we are going to be having today are really concentrated on those above subjects. Just to give you an idea of what this day is going to be all about, for today's session, we are going to ask all our audience members to please turn their cameras off and to mute their microphones. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute or so. This would actually allow us to direct our attention more in a more fulsome fashion towards our expert panelists, and we have 5 of them. I'm just going to give them some introduction, and then I'll continue the rest of the discussion about how the format is going to pan out in the next short while. Most of these panelists are quite known to you. Dr. Lloyd Weber, he's a poultry veterinarian practicing for some number of years. He's actually given me the actual number. He's been actually practicing veterinary medicine and poultry for the last 50 years, and he's a diplomat of the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. We've been very fortunate to have always had his wisdom, his insights, and I would say his unwavering enthusiasm, for sharing his knowledge and information. And as you know, he's also a poultry producer. He has his own commercial turkeys and broilers. And Lloyd's focus includes disease prevention through farm management, and he's also a strong advocate of the One Health approach. Our other panelist is Dr. Bruce Roberts. Many of you also know Bruce in his role as the Executive Director for the Canadian Poultry Research Council, or CPRC, for the past 9 years. I can actually say unequivocally that if it wasn't because of CPRC, many of our research projects, and as a matter of fact, many of our faculty wouldn't actually be here today. So I think we are all very thankful to the work that CPRC has done under the leadership that Bruce has provided for CPRC. Bruce has degrees from University of Guelph and also from University of Illinois, PhD in agricultural economics, if I'm not mistaken. And his education and employment has covered a broad range of agricultural areas, and he was an agricultural consultant in Atlantic provinces for the last 10 years. And as you know, CPRC is an organization that is formed by national poultry organizations, and the main focus is on poultry research and innovation. Mike McMorris is rather new to, I would say, some of us in poultry, but he's been a staple of agricultural industries in Ontario and livestock industries in Ontario. He actually grew up on a farm near the Aurora Research Center, and he's a graduate of Guelph with a BSc and an MSc. He's been working in the Ontario livestock industry for over 30 years, including several years, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 14, 15 years with OMAFRA, subsequently with Beef Farmers of Ontario, AgriCorp, Ag Sites, and he's currently the CEO of Livestock Research and Innovation Corporation. Our 4th panelist is Dr. Mike Petrick, who grew up on a large poultry farm in Ontario. He's a DVM from Guelph, from OBC, and also an MSc in poultry welfare from Animal Biosciences that was conferred upon him in 2014. He's been a laying veterinarian for the laying hen veterinarian for 20 years with McKinley Hatchery, and he's been involved in many aspects of provincial and national policy development over those years. Ashley Hansberger is, I was just going to say, is the new executive director, but actually I don't really think that the role is so much new now, but she was appointed, I believe, in 2019 as the executive director of Poultry Industry Council. And as you know, the main mandate of PIC is to provide education, extension services, and knowledge transfer to support a strong, successful, and sustainable poultry industry. And as a capacity development practitioner, Ashley has worked in Ontario agriculture for most of her career, and she has experience working with businesses from field to fork. So as you see, we have a fantastic panel put together, and if it wasn't thanks to teams, probably we couldn't really gather, all these minds, all these beautiful minds in one place and around the same forum. So I'm just going to continue by giving you a bit more information about the format. For today's webinar, we are going to be starting off by having each of our panelists answer a question related to sort of their area of expertise. And each of them would be given 6 to 7 minutes to answer the question. Then following that, we are going to have approximately 15 minutes of roundtable discussion among panelists. And following the discussion, we will enter the interactive portion of the webinar. And we are going to try to field questions from our audience for the panelists to answer. And in order for me to facilitate that process, since I'm acting as the moderator, we're going to be asking our audience, i.e. yourself, to post your questions on in the chat room. If you look at the left-hand corner or left-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a black banner. That black banner contains an icon for chat. So we would ask you to post your questions in the chat room, and you can actually start even right now without even listening to panelists. You can start posting those questions as we speak. And in order to gauge overall audience interest in questions, what we would like to ask you is to please like or do a thumbs up. And when you scroll on those questions, you're actually going to see a set of icons appearing. One of them is a like option. The other one is a thumbs up option. The number of likes and thumbs ups would actually tell me, how many people are more interested in one question versus the other. So that would actually help me prioritize questions. And then I would go about picking and choosing, those questions that I see them having, the most amount of votes. And then I would be asking those questions from our audience. And at the very end, I would ask each of our panelists to provide us with their own take-home message for our audience. And let me just see if there's anything else in my notes. Yes, I was also just going to tell you that our webinar discussions are going to be recorded for the purpose of producing audio and visual media, and it's going to be in the form of a YouTube video that we are going to be posting. And also we hope to have a podcast produced from our discussions. So I hope that that has addressed most of the questions that you might have had. And let me see if there is anything here. No, I think everything seems to be looking good. Okay, so having said that, let me start from my question number one. And as I said before, if you wouldn't mind turning off your cameras and turning off your videos so that we are only focusing on each of our panelists, I would greatly appreciate that. So my first question is for Ashley Hansberger. Ashley, can you tell us what we've learned from the COVID-19 impact on the sector value chain? And you have approximately 6 or 7 minutes.
Hey, thanks, Shayan. That's a great introduction. And I feel like this is such a great initiative because we're in such an unprecedented moment that to stop and have a discussion forum around what's been going on and what are the things we should be noting so we can move forward and move out of this a better sector than we were is just really, really important. So thank you, Shayan, for involving me in that. I jotted down my notes, so I'm going to be reading off of them because that's a really big question. What have we learned? All I can speak to is what I've been observing and absorbing from some of my colleagues, because as we know, poultry is such a diverse sector. So even though we're dealing with eggs and chicken and hatching eggs and turkeys, even among them, there's a whole bunch of diversity that needs to be accounted for when we think about planning and moving forward. So the first thing that occurred to me when I started to reflect on this was something around that verbiage we heard about essential work. So agriculture is essential, and there's a lot of reasons as to why it is, and the main one is everybody needs to eat. And that's why I started to get involved in agriculture when I began my career, is because there's not going to be any shortage of work for us to do if we have to continue to produce high quality food products. But that we are essential in technical terms and in terms of policies and whatnot does not necessarily translate into practicality. So when we look at the funding that's rolled out or the financial support for agriculture, particularly for farmers at the farm level, if we look at the understanding in the media of how agriculture is working and how it's maybe not working, and the consumer side, and particularly how our regulatory system impacts the access to different types of products, from packaging and some of those CFIA things that we have to do, we start to understand how nuanced and complex the sector is. So we're essential, but it's challenging to kind of wrap our heads around or bookend where that begins and where that ends. And when I think about the lack of awareness, particularly lack of understanding in the media conversations, we start to see how that rolls out in the aftermath of that huge market shock that happened. So early days, all of a sudden, we can't access restaurants. People start hoarding, I guess is the word, food. They start overbuying because we're nervous, we're scared as a society, we don't know what's going on. And then we turn around and see that milk's being dumped, for example, which was a tagline that got picked up in the media. There's just no understanding for why there's this oversupply and undersupply when that flow gets disrupted. And there's not as much understanding around how we can't pivot packaging because maybe the pulp mills are shut down and all of a sudden we don't have access to those same materials that make egg cartons. And when we have equipment lined up that does one thing really, really well, but doesn't pivot into doing other products at more consumer level or small individual packaged sort of end products. So we went through all of these challenges, and on the back end, all of these conversations and this network came alive of the great minds meeting and trying to solve these problems. But it's not necessarily reflected in the media that we were maybe struggling along the way, and dumping milk wasn't just something that we did because we couldn't figure it out. But anyhow, that was something that occurred to me. And on the note of the restaurants being closed, that was one of poultry's significant markets, particularly for certain size products. And so overnight, we saw one of our main markets disappear. So it was very difficult to just kind of pivot towards the consumer end of things. And I don't think that we've seen, the increase on the grocery end of things equal to the decrease that we saw in market share from the restaurants. And so from what I'm understanding on the Restaurants Canada end of things is it's going to take quite a while for that to even out. So restaurants are still open, but not in the same capacity. It's going to take a long time for people to kind of fill those seats, dollars per square inch kind of thing, how restaurant models work. So that's going to take us quite a while to kind of get back to where we were. But I think there's an upshot out of all of this, the upside, and that is that the food has always been there. So on the production side, we're extremely adept at producing products that meet market demands and market consumer interests. And we just have to start to think a little bit about how complex our supply chain is. And, once that bird leaves the farm, how we can kind of maybe more easily pivot along the way when something happens. The other thing about agriculture being essential is that we need to sort of take it down to the level that what makes it essential is it's the people. So the people who work on the front lines of agriculture, who work in the background like myself, we're in a very precarious state with access to trained agricultural, not only labor, but just, very highly qualified personnel as well. So a couple of questions I asked myself was, if a large number of farmers were to fall ill, are we prepared at the farm level to take over those roles? Is there the leadership in place? Is there the risk mitigation or the contingency plans in place that will help us keep the farm running? And secondarily, if we think about something like vaccination or catching crews, larger groups of people that are very qualified and very skilled, if one of those becomes unavailable, where are we left? There's a bit of a hole in that system. And so we just need to think about how we're going to prepare for those potential inevitabilities in the future. My next point that I was thinking about was something around more at the global level. So we're integrated into this global value chain or global supply chain, and it presents difficulties, but ultimately it seems necessary. There are products, there are foods that we need from other countries. I'm not too sure how many people would be interested in eating parsnips all winter because that's all we have access to, because that's what we can store. So the global supply chain is very necessary, but early days again during this pandemic, when we saw the borders close, the airlines weren't shipping, certain countries were cut off from our airports, we were restricting airports. That supplies the flow of essential goods. And a few of them that come to mind would be feed additives for poultry feed, personal protective equipment, not only a shortage on the production side, but also if we were able to procure it, it was very hard to get it into the country. And aside from that, even by ground transport, we were looking at, people crossing the border on a daily basis. And that potentially could hinder us from fulfilling some of our obligations. For example, when we think about chick procurement, So early days, we were discussing what the protocol was around someone who crosses the border on a daily basis. So if you're a transport driver who has to go across and pick up chicks or other supplies every day, are they in perpetual quarantine then during the pandemic? Like, what is that person expected to do? Are they supposed to quarantine forever during the whole pandemic? Like, that doesn't seem very fair to them. And so that one small role in the whole big system, we don't really have a clear protocol. So what systems could we put in place that would provide clarity for that person and that employer, and also to ensure that they're keeping themselves and their families safe first and foremost? So along the lines of being connected into that global supply chain, I was thinking a little bit about that buy local. So it kind of flared up again. We have a local poultry meat market here, and they were extremely overwhelmed with the sudden interest in buying local. And part of that was, you know, in the 20-mile radius where I live, the Zares kept running out of meat, and it was a real problem. And it kind of causes, again, that panic buying response. So it was really good to see that the government pivoted a lot of its funding, or some of its funding, towards COVID relief efforts that were hopefully a little more sustainable. So how do we pivot, you know, a small market to have an online presence and those sorts of things? So once you see those businesses taking advantage of that opportunity, you really do understand that agriculture is ready for these sort of higher tech investments. But we just need to, we as the Royal Agriculture, we need to see what the ROI is. So they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And here was this thing that maybe was the barrier to entry was a technological skill or a small investment. It didn't take much to get them over that hump. So that's kind of a really good positive thing. My last point, just to kind of circle back to my first point, is that agriculture is essential, but not maybe broadly understood. And my final thought is that we undervalue food in Canada, and there's so much that goes into, again, taking that bird from the farm and turning it into a saleable product at the market onto our plates. And the system that we have is probably a result of the supply chain system that we asked for as consumers. So we wanted a steady supply, a consistent supply, high quality, food safe, as part of our program, our Buy Canada brand, but we also wanted that at a certain price point. And so with supply management, we know, of course, that it's a system that ensures fair farm pricing, so that farmers are compensated for producing safe and high quality products, but also on that ongoing basis, on that flow sort of system. And Foodland Ontario, some of their research on the consumer side does indicate that consumers are very price conscious. But when we move forward through this, we're going to have to change practice, and we're going to have to use more, personal protective equipment on a daily basis. There's going to be things that add to the basic cost of production. So we're probably going to have to consider that our food bill is going up on the consumer end. And that's something that I think is just potentially one of our new realities. So those are just a few of my high level thoughts. I didn't want to steal anybody else's thunder, because there's a lot of great questions coming down the pipeline. So as we move through this pandemic, I'm just really interested to see how this initiative can kind of keep growing and support the next generation of agriculture.
Ashley, you articulated your thought process so nicely that I can't really add more to it. It was absolutely amazing, and I know that you've sort of instigated lots of discussions, and at least I see a question raised by Deb Stark. So I hope that we would have time to go back to those questions and start fielding those as we go along. So I'm just going to switch gears and pass on the torch to Lloyd. And the question I have for Lloyd is that, given a future livestock epidemic, or based on what we've learned so far, what do you think, Lloyd, are the vulnerable segments of the value chain? And I know that, Lloyd, you have a presentation to make.
As a veterinarian, One Health is my theme of everything I do. When I think about enzootic diseases, it has been mentioned by the CDC, Center of Disease Control, that 3 out of 4 of new or emerging diseases are of animal origin. So as a veterinarian, I deal with animals, but we're trying to protect human health. As a farmer, I've got a lot of experience dealing with situations like avian influenza. And when I think about this, I think of social responsibility. I have a client that actually had roaster birds, and because the food service didn't want a heavy bird, he didn't know what to do with his birds. He had no market for these birds. Basically, farmers think about economics, they think about profitability, but they also think about the stewardship of looking after their animals. And I had many farmers that were very concerned that perhaps their animals would not go to market, and especially those people that incurred high path avian influenza here in Ontario. So when I think of epidemics, who is affected? Well, everyone, but to different degrees. So who are the stakeholders? Well, the producers, of course. It's really about, in the hog industry, you talk about farm to fork. Well, it's very similar in the poultry industry. So you're talking about at the farm, and you got eggs, you got the broiler breeders that need to supply the broiler placements, and the turkeys and the broilers. The hatcheries, what happened in the AI outbreak in Ontario a few years ago, 2015, there were hatches that had to be canceled. Feed mills that weren't sure they could even go within that 10-kilometer zone around an outbreak. The processors that became very worried about even picking up birds. And of course, the retail and food services, with the dramatic decrease in the food services part of poultry going, there's been significant quota cutbacks, particularly for turkeys and broiler chickens here in Ontario. And of course, the consumers, when they've started to hoard birds early, I've had many clients that say they would go to the store and they couldn't buy poultry meat. So let's talk about human epidemics. Well, the hardest hit stakeholders are those that require close human contact. We have catching crews and processors where people are working very close together in the processing plant. The chicken industry, the broiler and the turkey industry here in Ontario is a situation where every bird, the day it goes in, that bird needs to go out on a certain day. And of course, if the workers are not working there, these birds are backed up in the barn, and the density, the bird welfare comes into play because there isn't enough room for a heavy bird. Employee safety, of course, came out. This happens in hatcheries with close working quarters and processing, and definitely in the retail and the food service. Economics, the reduced sales. There's a lot of young people entering the poultry industry, and they're highly leveraged on their mortgages. And of course, when the demand for poultry goes down, that means the amount of product that they ship goes down. Welfare is always on the minds of poultry producers. They want destination for their market age birds. And when I think of this, I think of leghorn flocks. If the processor doesn't want to take leghorn flocks, they have to go to an alternate means of euthanizing their birds. When I think about the vulnerable sections, or longer-lived birds are certainly those that are hardest hit. The federally reported diseases result in issues with exports. Like we've got primary breeders here in Canada that if we have a high path AI in Ontario and that breeder operation is located here, there might be great difficulty in exporting birds to other countries. I had personal experience in the 1984 Pennsylvania high path H5N2 outbreak, and this was my personal experience. At that time in 1984, I had a lot of clients that would get a live haul truck coming onto their farm, and that live haul truck had picked up birds on 3 different farms. The chicken crates were not washed. I think that was the year that we invented biosecurity. I heard Matt Cuddy at the time And I remember Matt Cuddy coming in my office one day, and he had a white suit on. He could have done open heart surgery. He came up with this phrase, and that phrase was, biosecurity doesn't cost, it pays. Anyway, we learned a lot of lessons back then, and of course, stress entered into it. If we had looked at the AI outbreaks that happened in the USA, and even more recently, it amounts into hundreds of millions of dollars. When I think of British Columbia in 2004, 19 million birds were euthanized in the Fraser Valley. And very interesting, I grew some birds because they had no chickens to be sold in the storage in BC. The rest of Canada kicked in and they grew chickens so that people would not be shorted on good quality protein. And so when I think about that, I think of a lot of stress that goes on in the farming community. And I guess it was when you get a CFIA, a government person with a lot of power, it's very clear, he says, that an aggressive approach is needed to control a highly contagious bird disease. You know, when the locks are on the gate and the police are there at the end of the laneway, we know that we're dealing with a pretty serious situation. When I think of that, I guess I think of Ontario in 2015. I grew some chicken broilers for a roaster grower that was 5 kilometers away from an actual high path AI outbreak. And I remember that he was a very unhappy individual, but there was absolutely no alternative, because we knew that distance between an active outbreak and a neighboring operation is very, very important. I guess what I think about there were 3 farms affected, but there was a lot of high value. There was a high value turkey breeder farm that depopulated, and you cannot replace some grandparent and parent stock that you've been producing, and you needed them. And so you talked about many millions of dollars lost there. And when I think about United States, 43 million birds in 15 states that were euthanized, egg prices jumped 120%. One thing about Canada versus the large operations in the USA, if you have 1 million birds on a farm in the USA, 1 million layers, you know that they're all susceptible to being taken out. One good thing about our Canadian system, we have smaller operations. So what are the consequences of poultry epidemics? Well, the economics, the depopulation, the downtime, the cleaning and disinfecting, the loss of income. When I think of the processors, the supply chain disruption, the distribution, just the loss of product. When it's lost, it's a crime. Meaning, when I say it's a crime, it's a financial loss, but it also is a loss to how people feel about it. When I think of welfare, what I really think about here, if you have something like African swine fever in Western Canada, in the wild boars, how would our population look upon destroying those wild animals that people love to eat? So we have to think of the welfare in any mass depopulation or partial depopulation. And the stresses are certainly there. As a veterinarian, I've also had experiences with salmonella, which of course can go from poultry to people, and also mycoplasmas that really resulted in great economic losses, and a lot of birds were destroyed, unfortunately.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. That was very enlightening, I have to say. And when you spoke about avian influenza virus, that actually reminded me of some anecdotal evidence from my home country of Iran that in 2017, I believe there was an outbreak of avian influenza. I believe it was a high-path H5N8, if I recall correctly, but I have some of my colleagues on the call here, and they can correct me if I'm wrong. And that actually led to potentially, maybe directly or indirectly, it led to a major jump in the price of eggs. And as a result of that, there were actually food insecurities. And as a result of food insecurity, we had riots on the streets of the capital in Iran, showing that, even a small outbreak, or perhaps, a mid-sized outbreak, could actually result in major instability, in our food processes and in food systems. So that does actually tell me that everything is so interconnected and so highly intricate that things could go wrong quite easily and very rapidly. We do actually have a few questions popping up, so I encourage all audience to post their questions, and also please vote your question of choice, with your thumbs up or with your like sign. I'm just going to go to the next panelist, who happens to be Mike Petrick. Mike, my question to you is basically in two portions. How can the sector value chain better safeguard and respond to a future epidemic or pandemic? And what do we need to do to create that readiness? So Mike, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. When I got thinking about this, it's always been my response to emergency preparedness is that there's a limit to how prepared we can be for a future epidemic, because it depends entirely on what the shape of the epidemic is. So like Lloyd had said, if we're dealing with an animal disease versus a human disease, the method of spread is really important. So our precautionary measures and our responses are going to be dictated by the type of disease. If we have a true aerosol spread versus contaminated droplets versus contact spreading. So, again, we have to have some ideas what we're going to do. The other factor I think that's important in a future epidemic would be morbidity versus mortality rates. COVID-19 is a really interesting, to me, case study in that for the majority of people, it's a low impact disease. And so, the fear of catching it is limited unless it gets into the very susceptible population. But imagine if this was something like Ebola, where, the exposing yourself at all is a very, very dangerous, proposition for anyone who catches it. Again, that'll change how we're going to approach and react to a pandemic. So I guess the way I look at emergency response is rules of thumb and philosophical approaches. And I think this epidemic and the things that we've seen both here and in the States and in other places, redundancy and extra capacity is necessary to be able to respond to interruptions. We need to be able to transfer product and capacity between companies. We all work for a profit. We all have businesses that are meant and exist strictly to make money. That's the point of having them. But when we get into an emergency situation, being able to transfer from one group to another with less emphasis or consideration for the profitability is necessary to deal in emergency times. We need to be able to transfer the products that we produce for commercial use versus personal use. There's all kinds of examples with the dumping of milk, the inability to get cheese to the store because they're all in giant wheels that are supposed to go to big pizza factories. We have vats of liquid egg that we couldn't get to consumers because there's no way to package them in a way that is acceptable. So we need to be more nimble in being able to switch between the industrial size and industrial packaged type of product that we produce to consumer type production. And the next pandemic may work in the exact opposite way, where we're going to have trouble supplying the consumer at home, and we'll need to do it through industrial production. So we need to be able to go both directions. We need smaller and more diverse delivery of all of our products. So the farmer's market, the local butcher, the backyard flocks, there's actually not a ready to lay pullet available to be bought in Ontario until November. So the backyard flock in Ontario, and likely the other provinces as well, have exploded because people want to have access to some type of food that is controlled and local and won't get caught up in control measures. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, and I've seen a lot of really good things happening in our industries, and quite likely other places as well, but we all pay attention more to things that happen close to home. When we get into trouble, when the rubber hits the road and we're not able to send some of our products to market, the last ditch plans that we've had to donate what we can rather than dispose of. In any epidemic, there are lots of sectors in desperate need. There are people who are really having struggles affording food and finding food. The lineups at food banks are huge. And so the milk that was able to be donated to these food banks, I know the Egg Farmers of Ontario donated millions of eggs because we weren't able to market them. We weren't able to use them in our typical marketing type places. We were able to give a lot of them away, which is it's important. And rather than disposing of them in a time where there's going to be difficult access to food, it's nice to get that out to the people who really need it and are going to really need it. That gets to the flip side of all of that. I think we need to be more diversified, less centralized. But the agricultural sector has been very, very efficient, and always has been, at meeting the demands placed on it by markets. So until recently, very recently, the emphasis has been on safe, abundant, inexpensive, and high quality food. And Canadian agriculture, especially, I would argue, the supply managed sectors, have met that demand very, very well. The problem is, if we decentralize, it's going to be less cost effective, and it's going to be more expensive products. So to combat that, we need to somehow, through our marketing, through our communications, and through our interactions with the public, we need to add value to the robustness of our system. So to have a system that has some fallback plans, that has some diversity, has some nimbleness, is going to increase the cost of some of these products. And we need that to be appreciated. I think that this food insecurity that we've had has been a very strong support for our supply managed systems, where we have a domestic supply for our Canadian demand, and that has not been very interrupted. We've had some supply issues and we've had some delivery issues, and that's going to be an issue no matter what. But not having to rely on imports from other places for our food, or for much of our food, has been a big boon. And I think it's something that is going to prop up the idea of supply management. The other thing that I am pleased with our supply managed systems is that when we have disruptions and when we have problems, we're able to distribute the cost of that and the burden of that to the entire sector. So we've had cutbacks in chicken meat demand, and we've dealt with that by decreasing the allocations for the next couple of placements in order to level that out and not have to put all of the onus on that for the company that was supplying restaurant meat. I see in the States, there have been barns of laying hens gassed because they were producing industrial only product. And since the industrial product was lost demand, those birds were actually destroyed, and certain farmers were hit extremely hard. We're able to blunt that impact on individuals and even it out throughout the industry, which I think is a very strong system and provides us with a lot of backbone. The other issue, I guess, and it's maybe a little pessimistic of me. I think it's something that needs to be considered, is that it's difficult, and it may even be a mistake, to design a production system to protect against a once-in-a-century disruption. So everybody talks about the last major issue that we had was the 1918 flu pandemic, and have drawn a lot of parallels to it. But it needs to be considered whether it's worth dismantling or disrupting or redesigning our food delivery system in order to protect against what may happen in a certain way that we can't predict in another 100 years or another 80 years. And I think that's a discussion that maybe is not popular, but I think it needs to be considered as we're moving forward and trying to make redundancies and to be prepared for the next pandemic. And I guess that's pretty much all of my thoughts on that, and I'll welcome any questions.
Excellent. Excellent, Mike. Very thought-provoking, and some of the ideas are really worth maybe having a series of webinars as opposed to just 6 or 7 minutes of a discussion. But in the interest of time, let me go to Mike McMorris, and I have a question for Mike, and this is probably very much aligned with his interest. Mike, what will the post-pandemic poultry industry in Canada or in Ontario look like?
Great, thanks, Shayan. Just to pick up on Mike Petrick's, I've been fascinated living through the pandemic like everybody else, listening to some people say everything has changed forever. And I think the reality is that no, it clearly won't, but it's a case of what will change going forward. So challenging question to look ahead into the future at the best of times. These times, it's a real challenge. So I want to give you a bit of how I came up with some bold predictions. So to think ahead regarding the poultry sector, I considered 3 things: how it was positioned for resilience going into the pandemic, how it has adapted to short-term impacts of COVID so far, and also what sort of world the poultry sector will be operating in as we return to some sense of normality. So entering the pandemic, the poultry sector was on a roll. It had increasing per capita consumption. It had a decades-long run of gaining strength compared to competing livestock proteins. There was always a threat of disease and a challenge with labor, but supply management and strong consumer demand afforded consistent growth and predictability. The system, to me, seems that it was pretty resilient heading into COVID. When COVID hit, the supply chain of the poultry sector, like those of other livestock sectors, was exposed as more complex, spiderweb-like, and inelastic than many knew. Significant adjustments were required when retail food service demand profiles changed, and it's unclear what new profiles will look like, with many restaurants now predicted never to reopen. Another significant impact in the livestock sector, again poultry included, was worker health in poultry plants and subsequent plant closures, creating pinch points. The processing industry has, like most other industries, concentrated in the name of efficiency. A hidden cost of that efficiency has been exposed, and it will need to be addressed. I'm sure you all know Temple Grandin, just last month, she was quoted as saying that, talking about concentration in the processing sector, big isn't bad, it is fragile. We can expect a lengthy debate about having redundancy as insurance built into systems, but at the end of the day, consumers have to be prepared to pay for that redundancy, and that's to be seen. Historically, consumers have not been prepared to pay for redundancy. They may be somewhat more into the future. So post-pandemic, this is harder because it is possible that COVID may become something we live with rather than something we say goodbye to. And that makes the starting point of post-pandemic really hard to know when does post-pandemic even actually start. It's rather blurry. Regardless, the poultry sector is extremely fortunate, I think, not to be reliant on what is sure to be a chaotic world in which trade is disorderly, international relationships are frayed and fluid, and the term globalization is seen in a less favorable light. Closer to home, COVID has forced all governments to take actions that only 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. On May 12th, the Parliamentary Budget Officer stated that his own earlier forecast of a federal deficit of $252 billion is now on the very optimistic side. Rest assured, every level of government, right down to your township, will be struggling financially for years to come. Okay, so with that as my input, here are my 5 predictions about the post-pandemic poultry industry. Fewer people. Labor was already an issue, and now workers will be viewed as a health risk as well. This will mean more automation throughout the entire system, farm level processing, etc. Not new, it was a trend that was underway. It will be, I think, made much more rapid heading forward. Number 2, artificial intelligence becomes real. As more labor is done automatically, data capture will become easy and routine. Data itself is interesting, but by implementing AI, it can be a goldmine. I heard a talk last week as part of the recent Alltech One conference, and it struck me 2 ways. One, the speaker was from Microsoft, and the second thing that struck me was he was bang on with regards to why data collection and AI have not reached as far into agriculture as some other sectors. It's all about infrastructure, ease of use, and return on investment. And Microsoft is finding creative ways, including the use of unused television bandwidths to carry data in rural areas with poor internet service. I think AI is about to get real for agriculture. Number 3, more collaboration across sectors. Many diseases affect multiple species, and so cross-sector preparedness is not an option, it's an absolute must. Following the foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK in 2001, we got somewhat serious about preparedness, but now we simply have to develop and regularly test a complete cross-sector plan. Number 4, greater link to human health. Post-pandemic, every human on Earth will have lived through an epidemic as the animals. And so everyone will have some knowledge and opinions about zoonoses, plans, infection rate, biosecurity, etc. The human-animal connection will be part of any livestock planning, and so the approach of One Health, which Lloyd has already mentioned, already in play pre-pandemic, will gain prominence in agriculture and impact all sectors, poultry included. Number 5, more accountability. One of the legacies of COVID may well be how we care for our seniors. Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about seniors in the context of poultry. Governments already severely strapped by deficits will need to deal with issues such as senior care. Should an epidemic hit the poultry industry anytime soon, there will be far less appetite and much less ability to provide the recovery programs of the past. I know significant effort has been made by the poultry sector with regards to biosecurity. I think that we can expect that to double. It simply will need to be in place and taken seriously on every single farm. Recovery funds from government may well be limited to those sectors and individuals that can demonstrate that they have taken every step possible with regards to disease detection, prevention, and eradication. My favorite saying is that the best way to know the future is to create it. It won't be easy, but if industry leaders take this to heart and work hard to put forward creative ideas that fit within the reality of the new world, then I do believe the future for the poultry sector will be very bright.
It was excellent, Mike. Now I'm actually beginning to kind of actually pat myself in the back because I think, we've selected the best minds possible in livestock industries of anywhere in the world. And I'm so proud of, everything that I've heard, and it's been absolutely amazing. And Mike, just to make sure that I'm quoting or paraphrasing you, you said Temple Grandin has said, big isn't bad, it's fragile. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's right.
I think that really encapsulates, the way that things seem to be panning out over the last 3 months or so. So thank you for all of that. I'm just going to switch gears and invite Bruce Roberts to the forum. And Bruce, I have 2 questions, but the 2 of them are kind of hand in hand. What do you think, given what we heard from Mike, what do you think the role of research innovation is going to be in the post-pandemic poultry industry? And what do you think is the role of government, industry, and academic cooperation in the post-pandemic era?
Some of the challenges, and Mike covered quite a bit of these, so I'll run through them really quite quickly. The aspect of COVID-19 being a zoonosis transferred from animals to humans, it may have some real repercussions on the expectations for research and the type of research that we're doing on the animals themselves. And we need to be aware of that. Mike also talked about the huge costs associated with the pandemic, and in terms of impact on society, but also on the economy and government budgets. They are, you'd think you're back in the 70s when in inflation era, which dates me. This will result in further investment by governments for protection and security through such things as expenditures on healthcare, seniors care, tightening borders regarding food imports and people coming in. And when the governments, they have deficits now that are breathtaking at provincial and federal levels, and those deficits are going to eventually, they're going to start paying attention to them. And it sort of reminds me of being at the University of Guelph in the early to mid 80s when the top PhD students, I was doing my master's, so I didn't have to worry about it, but the top PhD students couldn't find jobs in Canada because the universities were cutting jobs instead of cutting positions and not hiring. So a lot of those top students went to the United States or other countries. I fear that we have a lot of potential to move back into that situation, because when governments start cutting budgets, one of the first things they look at is research, the money they put into research, and also they start cutting universities because they're easy targets, I guess. So these are challenges. How do we maintain a reasonable, effective commitment and budget for research? Poultry research is what we're interested in, but that's going to be a situation for everyone across the country who is interested in research. How do we mitigate these challenges? First of all, we have to be we have reasonable communications with government and academia, and the communications between government, academia, and industry are quite good, but we have to be better at it. our communication has to lead to research plans and initiatives that meet the agendas or the priorities of all of those players. We have to recognize the challenges facing each group. And when you boil down the challenge after you get the final definition out of the way, it generally comes out to it's associated with money. Where's the funding coming from? So that's a big one. Each group of the three, I'm talking of the three groupings here. Each group has to recognize and understand the other players' priorities. What's industry's priority? What's government's priority? What's the research community's priority? But besides the priorities, they have to recognize the limitations and restrictions on each of those types of groups. For example, this is one that I think is quite interesting. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has limited resources to do live poultry tests. They cooperate with some universities, but they can only go so far in what they do within their own facilities. And there is quite an interest in the poultry industry from AAFC's researchers. They can renovate what they have to house poultry on their research farms, but they are restricted from building new facilities. So we have to understand what's a limitation that can be dealt with and what's a restriction that, well, we may be beating our head against the wall pushing that one. So that's important too. Now, in this cooperation field, we don't have to become friends or good buddies, although it may help, but we do have to become partners. We have to work together and not throw stones. If there's an issue that has to be dealt with, we need to talk about it. We need to look for solutions to it, and we have to do so realistically. And that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And mind you, we are actually partners and we are friends and we will remain friends in the pre and post pandemic era. I know that I promised that we are going to have a few minutes for the panel to have a conversation amongst themselves, but I do see a lot of questions piling up, and I do want to make sure that we give some forum to our audience. So if there are no burning questions or comments or reflections by the panel, I would like to jump right ahead into questions from the audience. So let me ask the panel, and if I don't hear from you, then it means that the answer is no. Is there a need for the panel to have any discussion amongst themselves before we take some questions from the audience? I'm going to give you a few seconds, and if I don't hear anything, I'll go right ahead and start posing some of the questions from our audience. Okay, hearing none. First question that has received the most number of thumbs ups is actually from Deb Stark, and the question is about the distribution shock that occurred over the last few months or so. And Deb's question is essentially, was there any, first of all, were those great minds available, and did they come together quickly enough? And did we have enough leadership structure to manage the problem? And I think this was actually a subject that you addressed, Ashley. Would you like to take the question?
I can, I'll give a couple thoughts, I guess. That's a really great question. Thank you, Deb. I don't know. Like I said, with the industry being so complex, we have kind of compartmentalized a lot of the different functions within it, particularly when we talk about emergency management systems. So would I say that we had, a broad, unified, uniform pandemic response? Probably not. What would that look like? I'm thinking about what Mike was saying, which is I'm not sure how well we can ever prepare, but certainly I think there are things that we could do perhaps where there's trigger points. So if X happens, then this is the response, you know, something along a bit of a decision-making matrix or something would have been interesting. But I also know that there's kind of a higher level that's going on with all of this, which was just that sort of that experience of being a human being in the middle of a pandemic. I feel like there was a lot of disbelief that we didn't really think it could get that bad. And maybe Shayan was thinking differently because he's a virologist. But for me, I was like, there's no way I'm going on vacation this summer. It's going to be normal. But I think there was probably a huge human element that maybe stopped us from having those essential conversations. But I'm curious what the others on the panel think.
Anyone on the panel is more than welcome to join the conversation.
Yeah, if I could, I'd add to that, and much along the same lines. When we're in the early stages of any exponential growth, it's really just about impossible to know how exponential it is. I know I personally have a fairly high tolerance for risk, and I went on vacation in the middle of March. I'd been through many travel advisories before where there was precautionary statements about not traveling, and I traveled through them with no problems. So I ended up having to be on 14-day quarantine because in the early stages, when big mitigation effectiveness can happen, it's really hard to know whether they're appropriate. I keep looking back to SARS and what a tempest in a teapot it was for those couple months. And it was envisioned to happen kind of like COVID has and go worldwide and become a very infectious type of disease, but it never did. You know, it was much more easy to contain, and it was well contained with lesser measures. And so had we reacted very quickly and very dramatically to it, it would have been a mistake. And so I think that's the real problem with any kind of emergency is you can identify it and we could all see it was real, but to predict the extent of how, April and May and June would have been back even in the middle of March, I don't think anyone had an idea what it would be. And in all honesty, right now, I don't know what September is going to be. And so I think it's very easy to look back and criticize. It's far harder to work forward in a way that is appropriate and not make mistakes as you're trying to suss out a disease arc in the early stages.
Thanks, Mike. Mike McMorris.
2 points, I guess. I was relatively involved in the beef sector, General Manager of Ontario Beef Farmers, when BSE was around. And that was an interesting exercise because it really highlighted, like any exercise, there are so many parties involved and communications alone becomes a huge challenge. I think the big difference now is that COVID is something that is worldwide. It's not national, it's not livestock, it's not poultry, it is the world. So I think it's very fair to say that nobody could really plan for this, although there was a WHO plan that maybe wasn't followed well enough by lots of people in the world. But I think there's still a really good opportunity and a coming responsibility for each sector to identify which things they may have control over and then have everything possible in place. And Mike's right, you can't plan it to death and you might be surprised. But if the poultry industry doesn't have plans in place for anything that might affect it, that it can control, then it hasn't done its job, like any other sector.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do, I'll actually try to tie two of the questions together, one of which is by Evan Fraser and the other one by David Hall, and both of them are related to cost of production. So if we think that cost of production is going to go up, over the next little while for whatever reason, because of the increased costs associated with whatever type of measures we are going to be putting in place in terms of production, in terms of processing and so forth, how would that actually impact our competitiveness internationally compared to other countries, and with the potential that there would be some poultry imports from the US, and how would that impact our market, and also in terms of food security and the fact that, you know, a lot of people are unemployed at the moment, and food security is probably much more prominent than ever before, and all of a sudden if there is a hike in price of animal protein, how would that actually impact our consumers? This is an open question for anyone who would like to jump in, but I think, you know, Ashley, your name was also mentioned as part of David Hall's question. So would you like to start, Ashley?
I'm not sure. I was wondering, Lloyd and I were chatting a bit yesterday about cost of production. So Lloyd, do you want to pipe in?
Basically, my experience with cost of production is, as a turkey producer, our cost of production is it really comes back to not just your cost of production. It really comes back to what the processor can afford to pay for the product. If that product goes into frozen, if it has to be frozen, because the minute you freeze chicken or turkey that you cannot sell, you cannot charge as much for it. What I'm thinking on cost of production, no, it's to the end user. When you have to buy that product, that's where that's the problem. Even though we have supply management, it doesn't mean that you are going to be paid exactly what your cost of production is. Like we have to work collaboratively. That's a good term, where you say, okay, we will take lower margins. In fact, that's what the turkey farmers of Ontario and Canada are doing now. They're cutting our cost of production down because it's in sympathy to the processors. Without processors, we cannot survive. We're not an island unto ourselves. And so collaboratively working together and taking lower margins is not a bad thing. My thinking is that we have to give and take, and we're in a situation now where we have to give and take and have lower margins to survive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. And I think that kind of actually resonates well with me, because it also reminds me of what Mike Petrick was talking about, you know, being competitive, but at the same time, you know, being very cooperative and being very collaboratively, work very collaboratively with some of your competitors, you know, when it comes down to it. Mike, do you have any further comments to add to this?
Yeah, I'm you know, concerned about cost of production and concerned about affordability in that, like everyone. But like I said earlier, I do think that support for Canadian products is going to be higher. I think that the public is going to value a made-at-home product even more than they did before the pandemic. I think people have actually had a glimpse of food insecurity, which I never have. I've been almost 50 years on this earth eating food, and I've never gone to a grocery store and worried about whether there would be meat at the counter or whether I'd be able to buy chicken wings. And that's a big concern. Doing without chicken wings is a real hardship. And so the reality is that there are a lot of people my age and younger who have never considered anything before that box of food in the freezer or that package of food in the cooler. And I think that we're in a position right now and coming out of this where our and I hate to say marketing, but our communications with respect to food production in Canada has a real opportunity to show how valuable we are to Canadians beyond the actual dollars and cents. That's always going to play, and that's always going to be a huge component. But I think we're going to get a little bit of an aura of value just because we don't want to be worried about whether or not the U.S. is going to close their border to bringing in, basic foodstuffs that we all want and need.
Very good. Thanks very much, Mike. I see that it's 2:22, and I do want to give some time to our panelists to provide some closing remarks. But before I do that, I know that we still have quite a few questions that have remained unanswered, and I think these are not questions to be answered, but these are questions to be discussed. So what I'm going to do, I'll maybe combine two of the questions, and they're related to how we are going to be moving forward stronger using a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaboration. And I would imagine that this is also touching upon a question that I raised for Bruce Roberts. And also Mohammed down here, he's asking about how funding agencies and researchers can overcome disruption caused by this pandemic. And if I were to put the two of them together, Bruce, do you have, if you were to look into your crystal ball, you did actually look into it and you provided some very interesting view on this, but any further comments on how we can really move forward and move through this process, which seems to be actually continuing for a rather long time. If you'd ask me, even though, as a virologist and immunologist, probably, in middle of March, I would have said probably we are here for the long haul. And at the time, long haul to me meant 6 to 8 weeks. And this is week number 11, and there is no end in sight. Any magic words and words of wisdom that you can provide in terms of how we can make things more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and what's the recipe for success as we migrate through this process?
Well, that's a real tough one. It's one that we're going through now with the science clusters, Ag Canada's science clusters. How do we balance the funding and the research? And when we really don't know when you're going to be back doing research, that's one of our big questions. I think what has to happen is that there has to be some very direct discussions between the researchers and the funders. And unfortunately, you can't do that fast because it's pretty much a one-to-one discussion. We're going to end up having to have discussions with about 25 researchers who are leading projects for the cluster. And but I'm confident that we'll come up with something that will be comfortable for both of us. A lot of it's just discuss things realistically. That's all.
Okay, that's very good. I'm quite cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of other questions that we've left without being able to pick them up. At this point of time, what I would like to do is to ask our panelists to provide any concluding remarks that they might have, any last minute take-home messages to the sector. So why don't I go around the forum and start with Ashley. Ashley, any last minute messages?
Yeah, I guess as I've been sort of synthesizing and listening to everyone else speak, I kind of come to recognize that we have access to a whole slate of amazing tools and technologies. And it's going to be up to us as a sector to really start using them more fulsomely. And I think the more that we start to rely on things like AI and some of these other systems we have in place, we're going to build a lot more intrinsic resiliency. So moving forward, business probably won't be as usual. That's my belief, is we're going to have to move into this uncomfortable space and then kind of reorient ourselves. And livestock is going to need to prepare itself. I think we as a sector are going to have to really rely on ourselves and not just poultry, but all of the livestock together, and just sort of help each other out and move through this.
In my opinion, the the biosecurity we've talked about for years. We're making great progress, but now, in my opinion, it's got to be the major focus in poultry production and perhaps across all species. Because if you can keep it out at a very low cost by being biosecure, it resonates very well with the social distancing concept for COVID. But biosecurity has to be emphasized dramatically in the future.
I guess my take on this too is that we're here to look for, ways we can improve and things that we might have done differently. I'd also like to point out that this sector has done extremely well. We've responded in a way that isn't perfect because I don't think it could possibly have been. But the response has been very good. The cooperation, the communication, all that stuff has been done really well. And at the end of the day, I think our system has shown to have been quite effective. There's always improvements, and we always need to look for those ways to go forward. But I also think it's important to give credit where credit's due, and realize how well our sector has come through this so far in what has been an absolutely world-altering time.
So it may seem strange, but I'm thinking of another talk I heard at the Alltech One conference, and it was an Irish economist. And he got my attention because he started off quoting Yeats in a poem written in 1920 about the Second Coming. And he used a phrase about, in a time of turbulence and change, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I really think that as the poultry sector creates its own future, it's people like those on this phone call that need to see themselves as the best, and need to be bold and creative and know that there are others out there who would like to create your future, and it won't be a future that you would want.
Yeah, I think that probably the most important thing we can do over the next while is better align what the value chain and our end of the value chain, which essentially is processors, growers and processors and some input producers. We need to be aligning our research wants with what researchers want to do. A lot of times we have calls every year. We review things that are of no interest whatsoever to the industry, but the researcher thinks it's really cool, but they aren't telling us why. We have to have a much better understanding of that, and I think it's this sort of activity may be the way we move towards that, but we do have to do a much better job of aligning our priorities. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Bruce. And it's 2:30, and I know that some people have already started signing off. We've had lots of discussions and we've had lots of questions, and I really truly apologize to those individuals who have raised those questions, and even though they're absolutely wonderful, we're not going to be able to cover them today. First and foremost, I wanted to thank our panelists who spent an incredible amount of time today and also over the last several days working with me and also working with Jake. I also wanted to say thanks to Jake Astil, who's on the call now, and he's working behind the scenes, doing lots of different kinds of things, including taking a transcript of our conversations today. And we hope to be able to have, as I mentioned before in the beginning, we hope to have these posted on YouTube channel. And also we want them to be posted on as a podcast. So having said that, I seem to be actually losing my video. I think we've come to the end of the discussion, and I guess, this is a signal for me to say goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a fantastic afternoon. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye for now.